Welcome to Introduction to Ecology, Lesson 6. So in the last class, we talked about the physical environment. In this class, we're going to focus on how biological organisms deal with their physical environment. And that leads us to physiological ecology, which is the study of interactions between organisms and the physical environment that influence organism survival, persistence, and geographic range. So in this particular figure on the right, you can actually see how survival of different life stages of a particular beetle is affected by temperature. And so you can see that above 48 degrees Celsius, the larval stage of that beetle just does not survive. Above 48.5%, the pupal stage is not doing well, and above 49%, you have the adult beetles not living. But then down at 46 degrees Celsius, all of those different life stages are doing fine, about 100% survive. So again, this is that idea of how organisms interact with the physical conditions in their environment and how that influences how they perform. And ultimately, how different organisms perform in their environment determines organism ecology, and then sort of on a broader scale, population and community ecology, all the way up to landscapes and the biosphere. All right. So how does the physical environment impact ecology? Well, ultimately, it determines an organism's ecological success. And really that boils down to survival and reproduction. So the ways, there's really sort of a couple of ways that the environment can impact survival and reproduction. The first is it can affect the ability of an organism to obtain energy and resources that it needs to live, that it needs for metabolic function. And I think this is a good example. It's an ant, my favorite organism. And this is two different curves showing the sort of activity or the number of foragers of each species outworking as a function of temperature. And so this dark dashed black line is for Myrmicea pyriformis. It's that ant that you see in the first picture. And this light gray dashed line is for a different species of ant, Myrmicea crosslandi. And again, this is sort of the fraction of the workers that you see out foraging at different temperatures in the two different species. And ultimately, the sort of ability to go and collect food is going to determine how well you can grow and how well you can reproduce. And so if we take a look at cold temperatures, what you'll notice is that the Myrmicea pyriformis is foraging quite a bit. Even down below 10 degrees Celsius, you have over half of sort of the maximum foragers out looking for food. Compare that to Myrmicea crosslandi, and what you'll notice is that almost none of them are foraging below 10 degrees Celsius. On the other hand, if we take a look at high temperatures, it's sort of the opposite scenario. Here we have a large number of Myrmicea crosslandi out foraging, even up above 35 degrees Celsius, but you have almost no Myrmicea pyriformis. And so you can imagine that in one environment where it tends to be a lot colder, you might have Myrmicea pyriformis foraging a lot more, and out sort of active, and that will allow them to grow and reproduce better in that environment, and so they'll do really well in the cold environment. But then if you have a much warmer environment, then you'd have Myrmicea pyriformis out foraging, Myrmicea crosslandi out foraging, whereas Myrmicea pyriformis would not be able to get as much food and would not do as well under those conditions. So the environment can affect sort of the ability to collect resources. And that's one way that it can affect survival and reproduction. You might starve because you just don't get enough food, or you might not starve, but you might not have as many offspring, and so after many generations, you kind of die out. The other way that the environment can impact ecological success, and particularly survival, is it can just kill directly. And we saw an example of this in the last lecture with tent caterpillars, where we had those, one or two really, really cold nights in the winter in 1996, and that decimated the tent caterpillar population because it really just killed them. It wasn't about them sort of not being able to go out and look for food. It was literally about them freezing to death. So again, that can impact survival, and that's a way that the environment influences an organism's ecological success. Ultimately, how well an organism does in different sort of climates, and that, remember from the last class, includes things like temperature, but also precipitation, wind, everything like that. Ultimately, we can capture that in what we call a climate envelope. And so this is the range of climatic conditions under which a species occurs. And you can actually draw climate envelopes on the map, sort of outlining the regions where the climate conditions are favorable for a particular species to grow and survive. And you can actually do that under current conditions. And so this is an example for Aedes aegypti, which is the yellow fever mosquito, and it shows where Aedes aegypti should be able to live currently based on the climate conditions at those locations on the planet. You can also develop climate envelopes for future scenarios under warming. And so that's what you see in this bottom graph, again for Aedes aegypti, and sort of the dark brown regions, and you'll see that's sort of quite a bit of North America, particularly in the east. That's areas where under this particular climate change scenario, Aedes aegypti is predicted to occur in the future but doesn't occur now. So the idea is it might be spreading. Fortunately, there's also regions where it might be retracting. Those are the green regions where the climate conditions are currently favorable, but in the future they won't be. That's probably because those areas will dry up and Aedes aegypti needs at least some water. Unfortunately, those green areas are not so much in North America. They tend to be more in Africa. But again, that's the idea of a climate envelope. It's sort of where on the planet that species should be able to live based on climate. So again, climate envelopes can be used to identify geographic locations where a species could be found. This brings us to the idea of geographic range. And a geographic range is determined, at least in part, by what different species can tolerate in terms of climatic conditions, in terms of their physical environment. And so each species has a range of environmental tolerances that determine where it lives. And this leads to Shelford's law. And Shelford's law states that an organism's success is based on a complex set of conditions, and each organism has certain minimum, maximum, and optimal environmental factors or combinations of factors that determine success. And so we see this in the graph on the right. Here we see for a particular organism there's some environmental factor, and that at different values of that environmental factor you'll get different sizes of the population. And so anywhere that the organism can survive, even if only a few individuals can eke out a living at that particular value, maybe that cold temperature or that warm temperature, then that's still within the range of tolerance of that organism. And so that's still sort of its geographic range, but then in the middle of that range you expect the optimal range, and that's where you have a large number of individuals. The population should be really big because the organisms are, that particular species, doing really well there. All right, so again, let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Again, we have that range of tolerance where, outside of that range, no individuals can survive. There's none. Maybe, it freezes every year and organisms that can't sustain or can't tolerate freeze can't live. Well, that's going to determine that lower boundary for the range of tolerance. And then we have that optimal range inside where not only is the population present and maybe eking out a living, but it's doing really well. Organisms in that species are doing really well in that range. And so if we look at that whole range of tolerance, that leads to what we call the potential geographic range. And that's where a species should be found based on the physical environment. But at the ends of that range, it's not doing really well. There's just a few individuals. There's not none, because that would be outside the range of tolerance. That would be outside the potential geographic range. But there's just a few, so they're not doing really great. And that means that anything, whether it's competition with another species, whether it's sort of anything like that, might influence whether they're actually there. So organisms don't necessarily live all the way across their full potential geographic range. The potential geographic range is just where a species should be found based on the physical environment. But at the ends of that, it's not doing really well, so sort of interactions and biotic factors can affect that and actually reduce them. Then inside that we have what we call the actual geographic range, and that's where the species is found. And sometimes this is exactly the same as the potential geographic range, but frequently it's not. And frequently it's smaller. And that's because of, again, species interactions. So if only a few are eking out a living, and then they have to start competing with some other species, then maybe there's none eking out a living anymore. The other reason that you find the actual geographic range smaller than the potential geographic range is because sometimes species have difficulty dispersing to new areas. So if we think about historically, fire ants didn't used to live in South Carolina. And so, their actual geographic range did not include South Carolina. Clearly, though, their potential geographic range did, because the physical environment appears to be very good for fire ants here. They're doing great. They're all over the place, right? And the reason they weren't here back in the early 1900s is because they hadn't managed to disperse from South America. They hadn't managed to get to South Carolina. And so their potential geographic range included South Carolina, but their actual geographic range didn't. And now they've sort of expanded that range just because humans have helped them move about the planet. All right. Here's another example from the textbook. It's a particular tree species, and you can see in the dark green that's the predicted distribution, and you can see that the actual distribution tends to be inside that. It tends to be smaller. And again, that's because sort of at the edges of the range, it wasn't doing well in the first place, and then sort of any other factor can make it not persist there at all. All right. The idea that organisms can sort of tolerate only certain environmental conditions and then they really struggle at others leads to this idea of stress. And I know you think you're all under stress, but in ecological context, stress has a very specific meaning. And stress is an environmental condition that decreases the rate of an important physiological process and thus lowers the organism's ability to survive, grow, or reproduce. And so, again, every sort of physiological process has a set of optimal environmental conditions. And when you move outside of those conditions, the organism tends to experience stress. It doesn't do as well. It's more likely to die. It doesn't have as many babies. It doesn't sort of grow as fat or as big or as tall or anything like that. And so here's an example with temperature. That's just one particular environmental condition. It could be any. And what you see is that there's some lower critical limit, and below that, the performance of some function, whether it's sort of a metabolic function or a behavior or something that the organism needs to sort of complete its life, that's sort of compromised at the lower critical limit and also at the upper critical limit. And then there's some range where the performance occurs, and it occurs better and better and better up towards that performance optimum. And that's the value of that environmental condition where the organism does best at whatever it's doing, whatever that particular performance is, whether that, again, is some activity, whether it's some form of metabolism, anything like that. All right. So, if you're under stress, and there's stressful conditions that might compromise your ability to grow, survive, and reproduce, what do? Well, there's really just two options. Your options are you tolerate it or you avoid it. And to tolerate it, you either have to evolve or adjust to function under the extreme environment. And to avoid it, you have to either adopt a behavioral or physiological change that just gets you out, get you away from that terrible condition. So if we take a look at sort of a very stressful kind of physical event, it would be freezing. And again, we have those two options, you tolerate or you avoid. So one way is you just avoid freezing stress. And maybe you do that by migrating away. You just don't experience the freeze. Or you can sort of go into some kind of annual cycle where a lot of plants will do this. They're a seed when it's frozen, during the winter, and so they're not really experiencing that freezing temperature. It's not sort of a plant trying to live through the freezing temperature. Again, your other option is to tolerate. So you might say, okay, well, I'm going to tolerate freezing. I'm going to evolve some way to deal with being frozen. And then within that, then sort of the problem with freezing is ice formation. And so within that, you can either avoid ice formation or you can tolerate ice formation. So you might tolerate a freezing event in the environment, but you might do that by avoiding ice formation in your own body. And you can do that by producing antifreeze or solutes that sort of cause you to freeze at a much lower temperature. You can also do that by dehydrating yourself. Insects frequently do this. They sort of void their bodies of all liquid, and so they just can't freeze. They don't have to worry about freezing at all. Again, your other option is to tolerate ice formation. And then once you decide, okay, I'm going to tolerate ice formation, you have, again, two options. You can either, again, the problem with ice formation isn't so much ice itself, it's ice formation within cells because that causes cells to pop and burst and rips them open, basically. And so that's the problem. So again, you have two options. You can either avoid intracellular ice formation or you can tolerate it. One way to avoid intracellular ice formation, or there's a couple of ways, is you can regulate osmotic pressure. You can produce cryoprotectants or solutes that, again, inside the cell might lower it so that it has to get much colder to freeze. You can also cause extracellular ice to form around the cells, and that sort of protects the cell inside. It insulates the cell inside so you don't get ice crystals inside. So that's all different strategies for avoiding intracellular ice formation. Again, your other option is to tolerate it. Turns out we don't know any organisms that tolerate intracellular ice formation. It seems to be very hard to evolve that function, at least in plants or higher organisms. And so, again, not common, but that sort of shows you in this flowchart all the different ways you can tolerate or avoid different stressors, whether it's that broader category of stress, which is a freeze in the environment, or whether it's that narrower category of stress, which is intracellular freezing or ice formation. All right. So, tolerance, one way for organisms to tolerate their environment is to do what we call acclimatization. And I want to be really specific here. Acclimatization is the word that we use when it happens in the field, when it happens in a natural setting. Same exact process, but when it happens in the lab, we call that acclimation. So acclimatization is the adjustment of physiology, morphology, or behavior to lessen the effect of an environmental stressor. Frequently when you take insects, if you keep them in cold temperature for a while first, then you can sort of get them a lot colder before they die. Whereas if you keep them in a warm temperature and then you try and, rapidly drop the temperature, they'll die at a much warmer temperature because they're not ready to tolerate that cold yet. And so that's an example of acclimatization. So they sort of sense a stressor coming, they get used to it, and then they are sort of able to tolerate it much better. Same kind of thing in the lab. The only difference is that it's not nature that's doing the sort of preconditioning. All right. So how do you accomplish acclimatization, right? It's nice to say, well, these organisms sort of adjust in order to take on this stressor, in order to face this challenge. And so if I keep them in the cold for a little while, then they're much better at dealing with cold when I make it really, really, really cold. How do they do that? Well, there's a couple of ways they can do that. So one example would be they might produce antifreeze. And flounder do this. What you'll notice is the amount of antifreeze in their blood varies seasonally. And so it sort of really starts to ramp up in October, and then it peaks in sort of February, March, and then it drops down again by June and July. And so basically that's a chemical production that adjusts their physiology so that they're much less likely to freeze when the water temperature gets cold. Another example is you can produce thicker fur or more fat. The Arctic fox does this. If you take a look at the thickness of its fur coat, it's much, much thicker in January, February than it is in June and July. And again, that sort of protects it. And that's an example of acclimatization because it's a change in sort of morphology that enables the fox to deal with the environmental stressor of cold. You can also express different or alternate enzymes or other proteins, and some carp do this, for example. In warm temperatures, they produce one form of an enzyme, and that works really well and sort of makes the animal able to move really well and do really well in warmer temperatures. But then as the temperatures get colder, a different gene is turned on, and it makes an enzyme that does the same thing, but maybe has better function at cold temperatures. And then finally, we can have changes in cell membrane composition. So as you change temperatures, particularly as you get colder, cell membranes tend to get more solid and stiff. And so what you want to do is you want to maybe avoid that, and so you can actually change the chemical composition of the membrane, typically by adding polyunsaturated fatty acids that make it more sort of floppy and more liquidy at cold temperatures. And so we actually see this. This is an example in oysters and mussels, where both in multiple different parts of the bodies of the oysters and mussels, we see that in January they have a lot of these polyunsaturated fatty acids, so the cell membranes tend to be very fluid and they don't freeze up, whereas in July they don't have as many because it's a lot warmer there, a lot hotter. You don't have to worry about the membranes freezing up anyways. All right, so that's acclimatization. Another way that you can tolerate environmental stressors is through adaptation. And again, we've talked about adaptation in the first lecture and the second lecture. Adaptation is the characteristic of an organism that improves its ability to survive and reproduce. And so that includes improving its ability to survive and reproduce under stressful environmental conditions. And so again, this is an example we've seen before, where in Sweden, moose tend to be smaller in the south and bigger in the north. And this is an adaptation that allows moose in the north to be able to tolerate the stressful condition of extreme cold. And that's because the big body size moose has a much smaller surface to volume ratio, and so it doesn't lose that valuable heat in the cold weather. It doesn't lose that as fast up in the north. Now again, and we stressed this before in previous lectures, adaptation is a long-term genetic response of a population to the environmental stress, right? Adaptation is something that is selected for and increases in prevalence in a population because organisms with that adaptation, maybe it's big size in the north of Sweden, tend to do better. They survive better, they have more babies, they reproduce, that sort of thing. Adaptations can also lead to what we call ecotypes, which are populations with different adaptations in different unique environments. And again, we saw this example before with the monkey flowers, where we have a coastal population that has sort of a very different lifestyle than the inland populations. And again, that's sort of having two different adaptations to different stressful conditions. On the coast, the stress might be sort of cold, rainy, wet weather. Inland, the stress is drought. If you have enough variation in the sort of stressful conditions in different places and you end up with sort of ecotypes, ultimately that can sort of lead to one step further, which is speciation, where your ecotypes become so different that they're no longer even able to breed with each other, and that leads to a speciation event. And so again, that can be driven by stressful environmental conditions that differ in one place versus another. All right, so they're both words that start with A, and I guarantee you some of you are going to get these confused when it comes to exams. What is the difference between acclimatization or acclimation and adaptation? Well, acclimatization or acclimation is something that occurs in an individual organism. It might be a seasonal variation, something like that. So again, it happens on the scale of minutes to days to weeks, right? The organism is exposed to cold, and so it becomes more cold tolerant by producing antifreeze in its own body. It's sort of something that organism undergoes. So that's very short term. It's also reversible. You might produce more fur in the winter, but that's not sort of a one way. You're going to lose all that fur and have less fur in the summer again, right? So it's reversible. And again, the key is that acclimatization occurs within an individual. Adaptation is a much longer term process that involves natural selection. Again, natural selection acts on these adaptations and allows them to increase in prevalence in a population undergoing particular stress that then enables that population as a whole to deal with the stress. And so this occurs within a population. It occurs on evolutionary timescales, hundreds, thousands, millions of years. Right. So again, we talked about those two different ways to deal with stressful conditions. One is avoid, one is tolerate. And then we talked about different forms of tolerance. So we can have acclimatization, we can have adaptation. Now we're going to move on to not tolerating, but avoiding. And again, just like with tolerating, there's different ways you can avoid. The first and most obvious is behavioral. You can just avoid it by getting out of there. And a good example, again, something we've talked about in the past, is monarch migration, or in fact, any organism migration. When animals migrate, they're typically avoiding a stressful condition, often cold weather in the north. Animals frequently migrate from Canada down to someplace like Mexico to avoid freezing conditions. Another way that you can avoid problematic environmental conditions or problematic physical environments is through sort of metabolic avoidance, something like hibernation or torpor. And so bears can't really migrate. They can't get all the way down to Mexico. That would be crazy. So what they do instead is they basically shut themselves down. And frequently called as sleep, but it's deeper than sleep. Their body temperature drops, their heart rate drops, their activity drops. They basically shut down. They're almost dead, but not quite. And bears do this very frequently. Another form of this sort of metabolic avoidance is known as estivation. This doesn't happen in the cold. This actually happens during periods of drought, but it's the same kind of idea. These organisms just shut themselves down. They lower their metabolic rate to the point where it's sort of, they're not really they're living, but they're not really, really living. So both hibernation or torpor and estivation are forms of dormancy. So again, these are states with very little or no metabolic activity. And that's good because if they don't have any metabolic activity, they're not using energy, so they don't have to get a lot of energy. And that means they don't have to be out foraging in this terrible, stressful environment. They sort of don't have to be out experiencing these conditions that might kill them. And again, different forms of dormancy. We talked a bit about hibernation, torpor, and estivation, but it can also just be being a seed. If you're a plant and you're a seed, you're not metabolically active. So that's one way to avoid things like freezing temperature. That happens a lot in temperate environments like here even, where in the winter a lot of the organisms, a lot of the plants overwinter as seeds. In bacteria, you have something even sort of further with sporulation, where you become a spore and you just kind of wait for the environment to get better again. All right. So one of the biggest stressors that organisms have to deal with is temperature, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Temperature variation, like we learned about in the last class, is greater as you move towards the poles, and it's least in the tropics. And so, you can see that in this tropical rainforest in Brazil, the temperature is not changing much at all. But then as we move to Nashville, maybe we get quite a bit of change. And then in Russia, we get just crazy, massive fluctuations in the temperature. That's a global scale picture of temperature variation, but we can also take a more local scale. So in terrestrial environments, we have soil surface variation in temperature, and that tends to be much bigger at the surface where the sun layer is hitting, and it tends to be least far below the surface. So you have a fairly constant temperature, or a more constant temperature, the deeper down you go, and that's just because you don't have sort of that heating. It takes longer for that heat to get in through the soil, and so you don't get the rapid fluctuations in temperature as you move down. In water bodies, especially the ocean, you actually have very small temperature variation when you're out in the open ocean. And that's because the ocean is just so vast and water has a high heat capacity. And so in order to heat up the open ocean, that would just take way too much energy. So it doesn't really happen. Now, as you move in towards shores, especially in tide pools where you have very, very shallow water, you do get very much large variation in temperature. In fact, in large tide pools, you can end up with 20 degrees Celsius variation within a 5-hour period. So it's a huge fluctuation in temperature that organisms need to then tolerate if they want to live in that environment. Right, so different organisms tolerate different extreme temperatures. For most multicellular plants and animals, it's around 50. And so you see these in sort of desert organisms, sometimes in hot springs. The multicellular organisms that live in those environments, they can get up to about 50 before they kind of go kaput. You can get a lot hotter for bacteria and archaea that live in hot springs. They can get all the way up to 90 before they are sort of out of luck. And so that's almost up to boiling. It's quite shocking that organisms can live in something that hot. At the extreme lower limit, that tends to be tied to, your ability to live there tends to be tied to the freezing temperature of water. Some organisms can get sort of just a little bit colder because seawater freezes a little bit colder than the freezing temperature of water because it has that solute in it that sort of does freezing point depression if you've taken freshman chemistry. But again, that's sort of the lower limit for organisms to survive that we know of, and it's tied to when ice freezes, no organism can live through that. All right. So again, your lower limit's kind of tied to freezing. Your upper limit is tied to heating, and you might wonder, well, what goes wrong at high temperatures? Why do animals die at high temperatures? And really that comes down to biochemical reactions. And biochemical reactions are temperature sensitive. And that's true actually not just of biochemical reactions, that's true of all reactions. Hopefully you've seen something like this in a chemistry class, but basically if I have reactions, in order to happen, they have to get over what's called a transition state. You need the energy of activation to sort of happen. And so if I have higher temperatures and my particles are moving faster, they have higher kinetic energy, and so they're more likely to get over that hump and react. So here you can imagine sort of a state and it's low energy and it's kind of not got a lot. It tries to get over this mountain and it just doesn't, and so you don't get the reaction progressing. But if it's moving around really fast, it has enough energy to get over and it reacts. And so this is just the Arrhenius law. Again, something you probably learned in chemistry. And what that means is that reaction rates generally speed up as you get to high temperatures. Okay, so far so good. Why is that a problem? Why is these reactions speeding up cause animals to die? Well, to understand that, we need to think about biochemical reactions and what's sort of special about them. And one thing that's special about them is that most of them occur with enzymes. And enzymes lower the activation energy necessary to react. And so they make these sort of energetically impossible reactions possible. So here's an example where we have the reaction, and then without the enzyme, we have this really high mountain that the particles would have to get over. And with the enzyme, they have a much lower mountain. Unfortunately, enzymes are structurally unstable, typically at high temperatures. And so they'll actually denature, which means they sort of unfold and become floppy, and they no longer have the shape that they used to have. And if they don't have the right shape, they can no longer catalyze the reactions that they're supposed to. And so the minute you denature these enzymes, even though you're putting more energy in the system, you think, oh, my reactions are going to speed up. You're actually having your reactions, your biochemical reactions, slow down or stop because the enzyme necessary to make them happen are completely destroyed. Okay, so that's one big problem. And usually enzymes denature between 40 and 70 degrees Celsius. So that's sort of one of the limits on where organisms can live. If their enzymes break down, then their metabolic reactions can't happen. Before that, though, typically your upper ether temperature, which is the sort of upper temperature an organism can sustain or can live at, typically it's lower than where enzymes denature. And the reason for this is because of what's known as loss of metabolic coordination. And so this is sort of, you can imagine all these reactions are kind of like a finely tuned ballet. You don't want some of them coming in at the wrong time. Everybody has to sort of work together in step in order for the whole thing to work. And like we said, anytime I raise the temperature, I'm going to increase the speed of reactions. And that's true of enzyme catalyzed reactions as well. They start increasing as we increase the temperature, because there's just more energy to get over even that smaller hill. And so if I was at a normal temperature and I had two reactions, those reactions might happen at the same time, and so the products are ready to go at the same time, and then they can react with each other in a second set of reactions. And then those two sort of products will be in step, and they'll react to make a final reaction, and everything sort of happens in this highly choreographed, again, ballet. And that's the way it's supposed to be. Unfortunately, as I heat up the temperature, what ends up happening is that not every reaction speeds up at the same rate. And so reaction 1 might speed up a lot faster than reaction 2. And as a result, the product for reaction 1 is present long before the product for reaction 2 gets there. And that means it does its own thing, it does something else, and that's where the pathway breaks down. And so, if you don't have this finely choreographed, finely timed ballet, then the whole system can break down and you don't have the right end product made, and that causes the organism to die. So again, some reactions speed up more than others, and this uncouples the whole metabolic network, and that's lethal. All right. So how do you deal with these temperature stressors? What do you do in order to tolerate higher temperatures or changes in temperatures? What do organisms do to at least tolerate some range of temperatures that's not just sort of a very, very narrow single temperature where their enzyme works? One option is to produce isozymes. So isozymes are different forms of enzymes with different temperature optima. And so here you see an example of fish where it produces one enzyme that's really optimal at low temperature in the winter, and it produces a different enzyme that's optimal at higher temperatures in the summer. Now, producing different isozymes, it does happen sometimes for acclimatization, so in the winter versus the summer within an individual organism, but that's pretty rare. This example is sort of unusual. Isozymes are much more common as a means of adaptation. So here, different species, depending on where they live, are going to have sort of different versions of an enzyme that does the same thing, but it sort of operates best at different temperatures. And this is an example again with lizards where we're looking at an ATPase, which is a particular enzyme. And the alligator lizard that lives at lower temperatures, its particular ATPase works best at 30 degrees Celsius. If we take a look all the way up to the desert iguana, that's again something that lives in Death Valley in California. That's sort of in some of the hottest places on Earth. The ATPase for the desert iguana functions optimally actually above 40. So that's almost a 10 degree or more, about a 10 degree difference in terms of where that ATPase works best depending on the species. And again, that is based on where those species are found. The alligator lizard is found in somewhat colder environments than the desert iguana. All right. So another thing you can do to deal with temperature, we touched on this briefly, is to alter your membranes. Temperature can be a problem because not only does it cause this breakdown in metabolic reactions, but it also causes changes in the structure of your cell membranes, the structure of the sac holding your whole cells together. And the reason that temperature matters is that cells and organelle membranes are composed of lipid layers. And as you sort of cool lipid layers down, they tend to solidify. And as they solidify, this makes it harder for the enzymes that are stuck inside them to function. It's kind of like getting stuck in butter. And it can also cause the membranes themselves to leak. And so, again, how do organisms deal with this particular problem that's caused by temperature stress? What they tend to do is they produce a higher proportion of unsaturated membrane lipids, and then that makes the lipid more fluid even at the colder temperatures. The final problem with temperature is water loss. And if you've been out recently, if you went to the games last Saturday, the football game last Saturday, you were probably sweating. And so you should realize that as the temperature goes up, the rate of water loss by terrestrial organisms increases. And again, this is a form of stress. So it's not necessarily just metabolic decoupling. It's not necessarily just enzymes breaking down. It's not necessarily even just your cell membranes changing structure. Temperature also causes a problem because of water loss. All right. So we've got all these problems with temperature. How do we regulate temperature? Well, ultimately, the temperature of any organism, no matter what it is determined by the energy coming in, the gains, and the energy going out, the losses. The gains, one of the gains is solar radiation. As the sun beats down on an organism, then it gets that energy. Again, the sun beating down on you in Death Valley, that's partly what made you hot. So actually a lot of what made you hot. The other thing that made you hot is infrared radiation. That's the heat coming off everybody else and everything else. The heat radiating off the pavement, the heat radiating off your neighbor. All of that makes you hot too. Another thing is convection. And so as air kind of moves by, the heat from the air can get deposited onto an organism. Conduction, even if the air is not moving, heat in the sort of air above the organism sort of gets transferred to the organism. And then metabolism. For some organisms, the act of metabolism produces heat that raises their body temperature. So those are the gains. The losses, infrared radiation. Your neighbor is radiating heat that you're picking up, but you're also radiating heat to your neighbor and everything else in the universe. And so that's a loss. The heat that you already had and that you sort of released through infrared radiation, you're losing that. Convection, again, convection can be lost. If you are warmer than the air, you'll just deposit that as the air flows by. Same with conduction, you'll deposit it to the air above you. And then the final way that a lot of organisms lose energy is through evaporation or evapotranspiration. And again, I think in the last class we talked about latent heat. Anytime water changes state to gas, energy is used up, and so that's a loss. All right, so let's take a look at conduction and convection, because those ones are sort of, it makes sense the sun heating you, that heats you up. It makes sense your neighbor giving off heat, that heats you up. Conduction and convection are a little more confusing, and they can actually go in both directions. They can actually make you warmer, or they can make you colder. You notice that on both sides of the losses and gains. So when an organism is warmer than the surrounding air, then energy is transferred from the warmer, more rapidly moving molecules in the organism to the colder, slower moving molecules in the air. And that happens through a process of conduction. Just the sort of molecules moving at the surface of the organism jiggle around and hit the molecules above in the air, and onward the heat goes. Slightly different process. As cool air blows across the surface of an organism, it also removes heat, again through that process of the heat being sort of transferred to those cooler air molecules above, and that's called convection. On the other hand, so that was when the organism was warmer than the surrounding air. If the organism is cooler than the surrounding air, the heat flows in the opposite direction. It's just sort of reversed. And so energy is transferred from the warmer, more rapidly moving molecules in the air to the colder, slower moving molecules in the organism. And again, that's still conduction, but it can go both ways. It depends on whether the organism is warmer, in which case heat moves to the atmosphere, or it depends on whether the atmosphere is warmer, in which case heat moves to the organism. Same thing with convection. as the warm air moves across the surface of the organism. If the organism is actually cooler, then that warm air will deposit heat onto the organism through convection. All right. With unicellular organisms, the energy balance is a little bit more tricky. They don't have quite so many means of dealing with it. They don't really have evapotranspiration. They don't have sort of much way of modifying solar radiation. So generally they have to just tolerate whatever they got. They can't move to a different place and avoid the sun quite so easily. They just have to say, well, it's really, really hot, so I'm going to live here. And so you actually have organisms that live in hot springs and organisms that live in subglacial lakes, and they've just learned to tolerate those temperature extremes. For higher organisms like plants and animals, we can actually somewhat modify our energy balance. So again, here's for plants, and we said that, what are the things that matter? Solar radiation matters, the sun warming you. Infrared radiation matters, and so that includes both the infrared radiation you're getting off of everything around you, but also the infrared radiation you're losing. We said there's convection, and that the sign of that depends on whether you're hotter than the environment or if the environment's hotter than you. Conduction, and again, the sign of that depends on whether the plant is hotter than the environment or the environment's hotter than the plant. And then evapotranspiration, which is that energy loss due to the latent heat that you sort of lose when water becomes gas. All right. Now for plants, the most important means of adjusting their energy balance is to change their rate of evapotranspiration. How do they do that? Well, if you remember back to sort of courses in plants have these little things called stoma, and they have guard cells surrounding the little holes, the little stomates. And so if they want to increase evapotranspiration, they can actually open up the stoma and allow more water to escape, and as the water escapes, it goes from liquid to gas. And so that cools them down because that takes energy, that takes the latent heat. And so the degree of stomal opening then determines the rate of evapotranspiration. Now, the problem is evapotranspiration is risky when water is limited. So if you're in a desert, it can be really, really hot, but maybe you don't want to use evapotranspiration as a means of regulating. So the other thing that you find fairly commonly in plants is to adjust solar radiation. You think, how do they do that? How do they turn off the sun? Well, they don't. What they do is they alter their surface, they alter their albedo in order to reflect more of the sunlight. And so they try to become whiter. And so these are all desert plants, but you'll notice they're all kind of white. And they're actually white because they have sort of light-colored leaves that reflect more light than they absorb. And they also have what's known as pubescence. And that's light-colored white hairs on the leaf surface. And again, that pubescence makes the leaves sort of a whiter color, and that reflects the sunlight. And so that reduces the amount of heat coming in due to solar radiation. Pubescence, though, is a little bit tricky. Being a white leaf is nice, but then what do you do with the chlorophyll? How do you photosynthesize? If you still have chlorophyll in your green leaves, but you put a white layer of pubescence over top, that seems like a good idea. It seems like that white layer will reflect the sun, but the fact is it actually causes a different form of heat. Pubescence actually lowers convective heat loss. So remember, if the organism is hotter than the surrounding air, as that air blows by, the organism will deposit heat into the environment through convective heat loss. Well, if a plant is covered in hair, then that impedes or that slows down the amount of heat that's lost to the convective, to the air blowing over top. So, if the air moves by really quickly, then a lot of cold air is rushing by. This is like fanning yourself. Again, at Death Valley, you might have been fanning yourself, move that air by quickly in your face, and that will remove it faster. If the air moves much more slowly, right, maybe you aren't fanning yourself in Death Valley as you watch the game, then it removes less heat. Unfortunately, what does pubescence do? Well, pubescence slows the movement of air down. And so as a result, the slower moving air doesn't take as much heat away because it sort of builds up the heat and it doesn't move it off as fast. And so pubescence can actually cause friction at the leaf surface that slows the air movement, and that reduces convective heat loss. So even though it's good for changing the albedo in order to reflect the light, it's a bit of a trade-off because it can actually cause lower convective heat loss. All right, and so the reason it does that is because it sort of interferes with flow along the boundary layer in what's known as a zone of turbulent flow that's along the leaf surface. All right. So not surprisingly, if we're interested in modifying convective heat loss, especially from leaves of plants, we don't just have the option of pubescence. we can actually do some other things. So small, smooth leaves tend to have thin boundary layers, and so that means that the air moves over them really quickly, and that causes them to lose heat effectively. And so you frequently find small, smooth leaves in hot climates where the plant wants to remove heat, where it wants to lose that heat. The opposite scenario, if you have large, rough leaves that have sort of that thick layer that's kind of rugged and traps the air, then they retain heat effectively because they slow that movement down, they lower the rate of loss to convective heat. And so that tends to be good in cold climates. Another thing that's good in cold climates is to grow close to the ground. And again, that has to do with lowering that rate of heat loss to convective processes. One is that if you're low to the ground, you don't experience the high wind velocities that are up higher. And again, as the wind moves fast, that sort of increases your convective heat loss. This helps the plants, if they're growing low, to retain heat. And so again, growing close to the ground is good in cold climates. Very similar to having large, rough, thick leaves. You're avoiding that air movement quickly over your surface. Right, so that's plants. The energy balance in animals is very similar. You'll notice a lot of the same terms. We have solar radiation, we have infrared radiation, we have convective and conductive heat gain or loss depending on whether you are hotter than the environment or vice versa. We have evapotranspiration. Now I will say in this case it's not evapotranspiration, it's evaporation. Evaporative heat loss is actually rare in animals. It does occur, so when we sweat as humans, that's our way of cooling down by using that latent heat of water, by using that energy loss we get by turning water into gas. Same kind of process with panting in dogs, and also licking in some marsupials. However, it's fairly rare. Instead, what a lot of animals do to alter their energy balance is metabolism. And so this is actually a major ecological advance, and it only occurs in one subset of animals. So on one hand, we have ectotherms, and they regulate body temperature primarily through energy exchange with the external environment. These are things like alligators, reptiles, salamanders. They don't really make their own heat. So when it's cold out, they have to bask. That's why you see alligators out sunning themselves. They're trying to warm up so that they can actually move. Endotherms, that's like us, that's like all mammals, they regulate their body temperature through internal heat generation. So we don't need to go out on a sunny day. When we sunbathe, it's for a tan. It's not so that we can warm ourselves up in order to move. And so only endotherms can regulate with metabolism, but they do it very, very effectively. So if I compare endotherms versus ectotherms, you look at their body temperature and you look at the ambient temperature, the temperature in the environment. And so you see the snake that's an ectotherm, when it's cold in the environment, the body temperature of the snake is cold. When it's hot in the environment, the body temperature of the snake is hot. With endotherms, though, their body temperature is pretty much always hot. So ectotherms are the majority of animal species: lizards, insects, frogs, amphibians. And they have a much greater tolerance for variation in body temperature. So we don't do really well when we get down really, really cold. Ectotherms can survive if their body temperature is, getting close to freezing. They also tend to have much smaller bodies, and that facilitates the exchange of energy with the environment, so that they can sort of easily warm themselves up by sitting in the sun. If you're too big, it takes too long to warm yourself up sitting in the sun, and by the time you've done that, it's sort of night. The other thing with ectotherms is they'll frequently move to locations where the temperature is good, and that's the idea of basking. The problem with ectotherms, though, is that their activities are limited to certain environmental temperature ranges. Once it gets too cold, they can't really move. They can't do things. They sort of have to avoid that colder weather. So again, they don't have a lot of options. Again, they avoid or tolerate sub-freezing temperatures. With endotherms, these are things like birds, mammals, some fish. They have a much narrower range of body temperatures, and they maintain a constant basal metabolic rate. Now, that sounds good. That means they can move around and run around in the snow, which ectotherms definitely generally can't, but there's a cost. And the cost is that they basically have a little fire going in them all the time. They're basically generating heat. And that means they need to supply that fire with food, with energy, to keep it going. And so the energy costs are much higher. Endotherms need to eat a lot more than ectotherms, generally, to survive. And so endotherms have expanded their geographic range and the times of years they can be active. They can be active further north. They can be active later in the season. but again, it comes at that energy cost. But the benefit is that they can remain active even at sub-freezing temperatures. With endotherms, we have what's called a thermoneutral zone, and that's the range of environmental temperatures over which endotherms can maintain a constant basal metabolic rate. And that's sort of their operational range. Once you move outside of that, they're kind of under extreme stress. And so if you lower the temperature beyond the thermoneutral zone, you hit what's known as the lower critical temperature. And so even with endotherms, at this point, they cannot keep their body temperature constant. Ectotherms never do it, but endotherms cannot keep their body temperature constant at the lower critical temperature. And this is where the external temperature drops so cold that the heat loss that they can generate through metabolic heat doesn't really keep up. And so that actually triggers an increase in metabolism, and their metabolic rate shoots way up, and that's sort of when they're in the danger zone. Similar thing happens at the upper critical temperature. Their metabolic rate increases because they're under stress. All right, so, again, I said the cost of being an endotherm is the food that it takes to make that fire keep going, right? That you got to keep that heat supply, and so that takes energy, and that means you got to keep collecting it. Now, it'd be a really dumb idea to keep producing this energy if you were losing it really quickly. And so endothermy evolved because organisms developed the ability to retain the heat. And to do that, they use things like fat, fur, and feathers, things you don't tend to find on insects or even that much on reptiles because they're not keeping it in. And so evolution of this endotherm lifestyle actually required insulation that allowed it to be possible, because otherwise you'd just be losing all that heat and you just couldn't keep up. The amount of food you would need to eat would just be insane and impossible to survive. All right, so that's our discussion of how organisms tolerate the physical environment that we talked about in the last class. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, I will see you in the next class.